Hi, I'm James, a knee, foot and ankle specialist, and today we're going to talk you through how to choose your running shoes. Now, running shoes can be an absolute minefield. There seems to be new terminology coming out every week, but today I'm going to try and simplify each commonly used term within running shoe industry so that you have a better understanding of what each bit means, and the aim is to help you then understand which shoe might work best for you. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is stack height and drop. So stack height refers to the midsole, which is the cushion bit underneath your foot. It corresponds with drop because the drop refers to the difference in the amount of cushioning at the back compared to the amount of cushioning at the front. So for instance, you might have 40 mils of cushioning at the back and 30 mils of cushion at the front, and that means it's a 10 millimeter drop. So what that's useful for knowing is, say for instance, if you're standing in them, it places your foot forward. If you imagine like you're in a high heel, and it can put extra pressure on your forefoot. However, that can be beneficial if you're a heel striker, and it helps propel you forward when you walk or when you run. Alternatively, if you've got a low stack height on the front, it means that you got a little bit less cushioning, less padding underneath your forefoot. So if your forefoot or your big toe is a bit sensitive, it might not enjoy that amount of cushioning that you have underneath there. Then the stack height, the maximum legal stack height is 40 mils at the back. Now you could have a lot of stack height, but there's different types of cushioning underneath, and we'll talk about that later because that influences what you'll feel. I think one of the main things that you need to take away from having a really high stack height is that the higher the stack height is, the more unstable the shoe is. So if you have a history of rolling your ankles or obviously tripping or falling, a higher stack height might increase the risk of that happening as opposed to a lower stack height or close to a minimalist shoe. Then in terms of the drop heights, with high drop height we typically classify as 8 mils or above. The middle ground is 6 to 8 millimeters, and then a lower drop shoe is 6 mils or below, and then a minimalist shoe is typically 0 to 1 millimeters in drop. So then we'll talk about cushioning type. So you can have typically a resilient type of cushioning or a compliant type of cushioning, and what that translates to is a resilient cushioning gives you lots of bounce and feedback. So for instance, in the Hoka Max 6 you have Hoka's supercritical foam, which is super resilient, so as you apply pressure to it, it works like a spring and pushes you back. The more pressure you apply, the more springs you forward. Whereas in something like the New Balance Fresh Foam, it has one of the softest cushioning on the market, so some of the most compliant cushioning. So when you apply pressure to it, you sink into it, there's very little spring back. The benefit of that is it feels like you're walking on a cloud. So if you're standing all day, walking all day, this is super comfortable. If you're looking to run faster, then you might look at something like the Hoka Max X. Then there's another term called a heel bevel, and that's a bit more prominent in the Hoka Carbon X. Now the heel bevel is the bit that curves up at the back. This is really useful for a transition from heel strike, so it ensures a smooth heel strike, because if this was flat it could catch your foot on it earlier, so it allows your foot to hit the ground at a later stage, and then that helps transition through onto the forefoot. Then you've got a thing called a forefoot rocker, so that's where the midfoot to the forefoot points upward, so that helps propel you forward as you run. Especially if you're a midfoot striker, it really encourages you to push off through your big toe to give you horizontal or forward motion. Then you have a thing called a toe spring, so if your shoe curves up, you've got a big forefoot rocker. Sometimes it can be excessively upward and it holds your toes in a slightly upright position. Again, this is to accelerate the propulsion phase, but if you've got any discomfort on your forefoot or on your toes, it can be a little bit uncomfortable. And then within the cushioning of the shoe, you've got your different types of cushioning like we discussed, but you also might have a carbon plate. So like in the Fuel Cell SC Elite, you've got a carbon plate within the cushioning, and you've got PEBA cushioning. So you've got super resilient cushioning that propels you forward, and a carbon plate that gives you stiffness. And what that helps with is reducing the amount of energy that you lose and gives you greater energy return when you apply pressure to the shoe. So this can make a shoe really fast, can make a shoe super light, and it's typically what you'd see in the more performance shoes. Then in terms of the heel counter, this is the bit at the back of the shoe. So you have all different types of heel counters. So you can have a rigid heel counter that doesn't move very much. You can have a softer one that facilitates more movement. You can have lots of cushioning on your heel counter, or you might have minimal cushioning at all, like you might see in the Topo or in the Hoka Carbon X. Reasons for that could be to reduce the weight of the shoe, or it could just be a design for comfort comfort, it can come up a little bit higher or it can be cut lower. That can be important if you've got a sensitive heel, because the lower the cut, it can rub off the back of your heel. Then as we move on to the top of the shoe, you can get different types of fit. So for instance, you have the Max 6 and then you have New Balance. So New Balance are renowned for having a wider toe box. So it's a wider base in the shoe, whereas Hoka are renowned for having a tapered toe box. This can be influential if you've got a narrow foot or a wider foot. If you have a wide foot, you might not enjoy the typically narrow tapered fit of the Hoka, whereas you might find the New Balance more comfortable. And typically you'll find often in the racing shoes, they try to make them tight and snug to give a really good feel to the shoe, so like a sock-like fit. So it's super snug on top, and often you need to get a wider version in that, whereas New Balance are renowned for being comfortable and having an extra wide fit in the toe box. Then some brands have a slightly shorter fit as opposed to a longer fit. So often we find in something like the Asics Gel Nimbus, typically a little bit shorter and you have to get a half size up. So when people talk about a true to size fit or not, often they're referring to how long the shoe is referred to your actual size. So if you're normally EU 46 or US 11, you might need a US 11.5 to fit into the shoe. If it's a tapered fit, you might need an 11E as opposed to an 11D. Then you've got the tongue. So you get different types of tongues and different types of shoes. So in the New Balance, you've got a really cushioned tongue, so they look for ultimate comfort around the shoe. So then the opposite of that is the Hoka Carbon X3, which has minimal padding underneath here, and even less so in the Hoka Max 6, which is just a thin strip of material. Again, it keeps it super light and gives that snug feel when you lock down the laces on top. Then you can have gusseted tongue or non-gusseted tongue. So gusseted tongue means it's attached to the shoe, so it can't move within the shoe. So if you find that your tongue always slips from side to side, having it gusseted can be really helpful because it reduces the amount of motion there. Some shoes have a different technique for this, like the Topo, which have two little tabs that the laces sit in, and when you tighten the tabs, it keeps the tongue in a fixed position. And then in terms of width, so we can get two different primary types of widths. One is the less common type that you find in something like a brand called Topo, where it's super snug on the heel to midfoot, and then it really broadens out on the forefoot. Whereas most brands, when you get a wider fit, the whole shoe becomes wider, and that can be challenging for certain individuals, especially if you've got quite a narrow foot, but then you might have something like a bunion that dramatically widens your forefoot. So if you get a wider shoe, you find that your foot is just moving around in the shoe. So you have different brands like Topo, which accommodate just a wide forefoot only. Then breaking down the different types of shoes. So you have what you'd call a typical daily training shoe. So that's something like the New Balance Fresh Foam or the New Balance 1080. So they have some cushioning in it, it's nice and soft, a little bit responsive but not too much, and they're typically for longer miles, easier runs. Then you can get faster shoes, some more kind of performance based shoes, which is like the Max 6. So they're typically lighter, they're more resilient foam, they give a lot more feedback, often a tapered fit. And then you can get something moving into more of a super shoe like the Fuel Cell Elite, where you've got a carbon plate, you've got a special type of PBA cushioning which is super light and super resilient. But they often come at the high end price of the market. So these are typically something like €250, $300. Then the performance shoe is typically around €150, $180. And then you can typically pick up something like the New Balance for in around 120 to 130. So you got different price range to do different type of things depending on what your aim is. So overall, hopefully you get a better idea of stack, drop height, different types of fit, different types of cushioning, heel counters, tongues, and it gives you a broader idea of what you're looking at when it comes to a shoe. If you've got any questions on it, please leave them in the comment section below. And if you found the video helpful, do subscribe to the channel. We've got loads of information on different types of shoes.